you already said that much of this early research, beginning in the 20s, centered around twin studies and adoption studies. And I think I'm just interested in the methodology of this. Why are each of these two types of experimental setups, or semi-experimental, as you put it, useful in their own ways? What do they allow us to determine or control for?
Yeah, we know that all traits run in families. People have known that for tens of thousands of years. And so for as long as we've got recorded history, schizophrenia, people seem to know it runs in families, mental illness. And the question, it was always assumed to be environmental. That's where the word nurture comes from. It was a particular type of environment, nurture in the sense of family environment. And that's perfectly reasonable, to think, say, obesity comes from your family environment because your parents provide the food and role models for lifestyles and all of that. But these studies, twin and adoption designs, allow us to actually test for the extent to which it's nature or nurture. So the neat thing about twin and adoption studies is they're completely different designs with completely different problems, yet they come up with the same answer, which is pretty powerful because they do have assumptions. So the twin method compares, probably everyone knows there are two types of twins, identical and fraternal twins. And identical twins are genetically identical. You sequence their DNA and they're as similar to each other as you would be with yourself, say 20 years ago. You've picked up mutations, but those are non-inherited mutations. And identical twins are identical for their inherited DNA because they come from the same fertilized egg. And in the first 1 to 10 days of life, that egg splits, that zygote splits into two with the same DNA. So that's why they're identical twins. Whereas the other type of twin, fraternal twins, about 2/3, so 1% of all births are twins, 1/3 of those are identical, 2/3 are fraternal. Fraternal twins are just like any brother and sister who happen to be conceived at the same time in the same womb. So they're separately fertilized eggs. And then, like any brother and sister, they're 50% similar genetically. So the essence of the twin method is to say, if a trait is heritable, like let's take a trait we don't really know much about, like musical ability. If that's heritable, you'd have to predict that identical twins will be more similar than fraternal twins because they're twice as similar genetically. So that's the essence of the twin method. And the adoption method, as I say, is completely different. If the twin method is like a biological experiment, whether they're identical or fraternal twins, the adoption method is a social experiment. If you want to understand the extent to which familial resemblance is due to nature or nurture, you could study nature parents, that is, parents who share genes but not environment with their kids, and nurture parents who share environment but not genes with their kids. And that's what happens in the adoption design, where in the Colorado Adoption Project, which I started 40 years ago, we had birth parents who relinquished their kids for adoption at birth. And in those days, in the 70s, parents, unlike today, they had no contact. Part of the deal was they would have their kids and give them away at birth and not have contact with them anymore. So they share genes but not environment with their kids. And then we've got adoptive parents of those kids who share environment but not genes with the kids. So we also then had matched what we call non-adoptive parents who share genes and environment with their kids. And so just to make it concrete, with weight, you find that parents and offspring are about similar 0.4, a correlation that goes from 0 to 1. So they correlate about 0.4. They're similar genetically about 0.5, but they correlate about 0.4. So that's less than their genetic similarity. It's still a lot of similarity, 0.4. That was always assumed, perfectly reasonably, to be due to nurture. So if it's due to nurture, you'd have to predict that parents who adopt kids at birth will be just as similar to those kids because they provide the family environment for those kids. But the correlation in meta-analyses of these data of adoption studies, the correlation between adoptive parents' weight and their adopted children's weight is 0. So the kids are not at all similar to their parents in weight. Then if
That's
it's
very
not
interesting.
nurture, then it ought to be nature. So what's the correlation between the birth parents who relinquished the kids for adoption at birth and those adopted away kids, say 16, 20 years later? It's 0.4. It's just the same as the correlation between parents who raise their own kids. So that's why it's so powerful. It's like a direct test of nurture, a direct test of nature. And the neat thing is it corresponds to the twin data. So if you look at twin data, you find identical twins are very similar for weight, maybe 0.75 correlations, and fraternal twins are similar about 0.4. And it's that the extent to which identical twins are more similar than fraternal twin that allows you to estimate the effect size. You don't expect that fraternal twins to be correlated 0 because they're 50% similar genetically. So that pattern of correlations indicates a heritability of about 65%. So that corresponds to the adoption data. And we could go into it, but these two methods have different assumptions. But the neat thing is they both come down to the same conclusion. And now it's incontrovertible because you can do DNA studies and find the DNA differences that account for these differences in weight. So those are the two methods, the twin method and the adoption method. And also there are family studies that have been going on for a long time. They're like the base rate here. We know to what extent do things run in families? And then twin and adoption studies say to what extent do they run in families for reasons of nature or nurture?